Thank you, Julia, for the very kind words and for the Software Excellence Alliance for having me here today. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. As Julia mentioned, I'm going to talk kind of about sort of what she mentioned, that bridge between the technical and the business, and where it matters, especially in the age of AI. It sounds like another very exciting talk coming up where AI is also, not surprising, a big focus. And one of the things that I want to hit home, hopefully today with my talk, is why AI is a really incredible tool, but it really matters, just like any tool, if it's in the right hands with humans that have the right skills to properly translate that information into something meaningful for your organization or your business. Okay, so this again will not be a really technical talk. You probably have seen lots of technical talks and information about AI, but as you know, there's a new AI tool pretty much every week. Everyone's talking about how it's, going to do everything, take over all of that technical execution. Um, and this is not talking about what AI can do. There's a lot of people proclaiming lots of amazing things, but this is talking about where there's still a bottleneck in my experience in organizations, and that's in good translation. Translation, I define as the ability to, like Julia said very well, the idea of being able to take technical jargon, technical information, and turn data into something that somebody, especially somebody non-technical, can make sense out of, can make a decision off of. I come from a data background, and I think a lot of these concepts hopefully can apply to software and all technology industries as well. But the idea of technology is set to fulfill a purpose of meeting some sort of non-technical expectation. And so I'm hoping that through this talk, we can learn a little bit about some of the skills that I think data teams and technology teams should be spending a little bit more time thinking about and acting on a little bit more actively than they have in the past, especially with AI tools becoming such a focus. So, from a data perspective, AI can write code for me. It can build dashboards. It can generate machine learning models. It can do a lot of the process that a data analyst or a data scientist might already do. But you already might be thinking just because it can do that doesn't mean it's going to solve every problem that businesses have. And where is there still a gap? So again, translation, in my mind, a proper translation skill within your organization and individuals focusing on that as an active skill and progressing that is just as, if not more important. So this isn't new. Folks on the call might be thinking, oh yeah, okay, this is a talk about the value of soft skills. Yes, a little bit. I think it's incredibly important to have good communication skills no matter what industry you're in. But I think AI is just making this front and center for all of us. So over a decade ago, the big focus was, in my experience, okay, we need folks who can turn business questions into SQL, right? And then we can query a database, we can get information, we can trust that that SQL is accurate, and we can make decisions off of that. Very true and very important. In 2018, McKinsey had a study that forecasted that 2 to 4 million data translators would be required. This was an actual like job title that they talked about. I haven't seen this job really, at least in my circles, pop up as a specific role. But at the time, they thought, hey, technology is becoming such a focus, and we need people to bridge the gap between technology and business because there can be a lot of breakdown in between. So already almost a decade ago, people were talking about this. In 2022, the focus became a lot on analytics engineering, this idea of building systems that can maybe self-serve question answers to business stakeholders who are asking those
Understood.
questions. And then over just the
Hello.
last year, we see a huge
Yes.
influx of AI tools and non-technical individuals utilizing those tools straight to get the answers to the questions when they might otherwise go through, a data team or a self-serve portal or a dashboard or something like that. So, for these tools to be useful, we need proper translation and foundational semantic understanding within these AI models for them to be useful. And the people using these tools need to be prepared to properly translate what they're providing to the people around you and your stakeholders. So AI is only accelerating this. Just a fun example. My LinkedIn feed is turning into a lot of these. It's probably because I'm, interested in this and giving this talk. But just for one example to highlight is, I can't sponsor budget for a project that I cannot explain to the CFO. This was a quote on LinkedIn from a hiring manager who hired 14 AI engineers over the last few months. And only half of those AI engineers actually succeeded within a first few months of being on the job. And it was very clear to this hiring manager that the differentiator in who succeeded and who failed was not something that they could see from their resume. It was not their technical depth, their experience. It was their ability to build trust with people outside their team, the people who held the budget, the people who could make the hiring decisions and who could make business decisions at the end of the day. And again, just to hone in on why this skill of proper communication and translation is going to matter regardless of your role within an organization. If, in my case, directing a data team, turning ambiguous intent into precise instructions, trying to turn vague requests into something meaningful that somebody can understand. These skills are really important. But for all of us, if you've ever interacted with ChatGPT or an LLM in your job in any capacity, you know that what you provide to it is going to be directly representative of what you get out of it. And so this skill of giving good context to LLMs is incredibly important, and a skill that is increasingly valued as LLMs become more common. So again, prompt engineering, as folks call it, this idea of how you structure a prompt to provide to LLMs so you can get the right answer out, is by no means a new skill. It's being talked about more commonly because of LLMs being so popular now. But it's the oldest, in my experience, leadership skill, data leadership skill, or any sort of leadership skill, the ability to, like I said, get some information in from the business, have that context of why it matters, present it to the right audience on your team, get what you want out of the experience, try not to cause any frustration or miscommunication, and get the right response at the end of the day. That skill is incredibly important. And again, like I mentioned, this is not a technical talk by any means, but I want to use this opportunity to talk briefly about the value of semantic views or semantic models in using AI. If you've used AI at all, you might be familiar with this concept of semantic views. It's basically this idea that you can build like structured context code layers. If they're basically YAML files or Markdown files that you can provide to these AI chatbots that you structure. Sometimes you can have the AI support you in creating them, but it's a very human in the loop process to build business context structured in such a way that it's accurate. It's talking about where your data is. Maybe if you're thinking from a database context, what your schema is, how columns relate to each other, all that information that you might have embedded within your database or your documentation, basically like a source of truth for AI to use. So that way, when you ask it, hey, what's the latest in the last week in this information? You get a response that's embedded in truth that you've provided it. So that's to say that to build that, you need people, humans with strong translation skills to be able to properly provide that source of truth and trust that it's going to be right. And if you provide garbage in, you might get garbage out. So this translation quality, both in terms of interacting with LLMs, interacting with stakeholders, and utilizing AI as a tool within your organization, building strong translation capabilities are even more important. So this is all to say that lots of organizations out there are investing very heavily in AI tools to try to bring them on quickly, get people up to speed, it's all about speed and efficiency, and that's great. But you can't forget this translation layer because you'll just end up making the same mistakes you may have made otherwise, just faster. And this is one last point on the why here is really just the cost of getting this wrong. Just a couple studies that I think highlight the importance of proper translation in your day-to-day work. 44% of executives struggle to derive insights from analytics. This is from a study from the Harvard Business Review. That's to me quite shocking. Half of executives are struggling to derive insights from analytics that their organizations create. And then another study from Gardner, less than 20% of analytic insights deliver business outcomes. There's a huge gap there, right? And that gap can come from lots of different angles and for lots of different reasons. But the more that we focus actively on training our new reports and new staff coming into organizations, the more we can focus as organizations on actively working on this discipline of proper translation and building that muscle over time. The hopefully less of that gap of analytic insights delivering business outcomes will create. But my fear, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today, is that if 20% of analytic insights are delivering business outcomes and AI is going to allow us to create 10x more analytics insights, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to solve more problems. It doesn't mean you're going to help more people. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make more impact. It's just going to mean you're creating, again, maybe 80% of stuff that isn't particularly useful. And as folks on this call might know, a mistranslation at any step of the process can be weeks of wasted engineering time, and that can be multiplied across lots of projects. And it doesn't help anybody. It makes it quite frustrating. So again, just because you might be able to use AI to produce the wrong business answer at unprecedented speeds, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help you right off the bat. But these tools that are out there are incredible if used properly and built out in the right way with the right translation skills in mind. Okay, so hopefully at this point I've convinced you why this is so important and why I'm so passionate about this skill. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some things that people can do day to day to help improve their own translation skills and the translation skills of their team. So for any given project you might take on within your organization, I like to think of this in three stages. Basically, the beginning, the middle, and the end. The first stage is this upstream problem framing before you even write a line of code. How do you think about a problem? How do you make sure you're tackling the right thing? And how do you make sure that the solution you're going to come up with at the end is actually meeting the goal that you've been given? The second stage is midstream. This is, the bumps along the way, the red flags that you might otherwise miss. And this is increasingly important with AI tools becoming more rampant because if you're not catching these things in real time, you could go down a rabbit hole or you could go in the wrong direction, and that can make a big influence on your end result. And the third stage, I was going to say the most important, but they're all important. The third stage is this downstream decision packaging. At the end of the day, when you've completed your project, you've built your feature, you've analyzed your data, and you're handing it off to a decision maker, a business stakeholder, or a leader within your organization, how do you do it in such a way that you, A, make sure you're satisfying the original goal of the project, and how do you do it in a way that's going to be most effective, especially as that information is communicated upstream or to other organizations within it. So everybody's probably already doing some aspect of this every day, but I just want to hone in on a few tips and tricks and things that I found in my career that can make any person better at translating and things to keep in mind. Okay, so framing the problem, stage one, 5 questions that I think really, before any data work or work, technology work in general, 5 questions that should be asked either directly to the stakeholder if that opportunity allows for it, or to whoever's providing you the question. And I'll also caveat to say that time and place, right? Some quick questions you might not have time to ask every single one of these questions. Hopefully, some of those things are provided to you, and strong translation organizations will try to provide some of this information automatically when they ask questions and ask things of their team. But if not, or if there's any hesitation on the answers to any of these questions, it's very risky to move forward on a project. So what decision will this analysis inform, or this feature, or this project? Who is actually making the decision? It could be a few steps removed from whoever's asking you to do it, but who is really the decision maker here, and why do they care, right? What evidence would change their mind? What should I be looking out for when building this or analyzing this data? What's the time constraint? It's obviously quite important to make sure that we're, thinking in the right scope of time here. And then what does good enough look like? You might be familiar with the phrase success criteria. Basically, in a product-driven organization, the idea that, your product manager, whoever's in that role, will provide the success criteria to demonstrate, yes, this task is complete when X, Y, and Z are true. That is so important because you might not provide what they were expecting. And not only do they need to properly translate to you, but you, as the recipient of the question, will also need to make sure you're properly translating these questions to them and understanding their responses. If you can have strong answers to all of these questions, then a tool like an AI chatbot can be incredibly helpful because all of this detail and context could be provided to that bot so they understand the right type of answers and the right context behind it. So, as folks might be familiar with, a lot of data projects failures might originate in this first step. If you're not going in the right direction, you might not end up in the right destination. So just a couple fun examples from my experience. If you get a raw request, a vague request that's like, we need to understand engagement, um, could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But to have something that's a little bit more actionable, you could have something that's like the following. Among users who completed onboarding in Q1, what's the 7-day return rate by acquisition channel? We need to decide by Friday whether to invest in onboarding improvements. That gives you basically the who, what, when, where, why, how. It tells you how much time you have to complete this task. It tells you why somebody cares, who cares, and that tells you a lot of information. If you just provided, we need to understand engagement to an AI chatbot, it might do a lot of things that you weren't expecting. It might go off in the wrong direction. So, understanding how to properly phrase both to AI as well as to folks within your team, incredibly important. And the same thing is true for maybe non-data related work. Is this feature working? Well, somebody might ask if a feature is working, but what they interpret working to be might mean something different than to somebody else. So it's important to clarify what do you mean by is this feature working? For instance, comparing conversion rate for feature exposed versus control users over the last 30 days. Okay, well, why do we care? Well, we're deciding whether or not to roll out to 100% of users or kill the feature. All of these things are really important in keeping in mind. And as we go through a bit busy lives and busy days, it can be really tough sometimes to actively think about, do I actually know the question that's being asked of me, or do I just think I do? And verification and validation are incredibly important. Okay, stage two, quality judgment. Again, this is that sort of red flags that might pop up along the way. And in my experience, the type of thing that AI tools right out of the box without any context built in might miss. There's lots of different examples of this depending on your discipline, depending on the type of project you're working on. You might even already be starting to think of things that your last interaction with ChatGPT or equivalent might have missed. But just a few examples to maybe keep you thinking. One is definition drift, right? Again, like I said before, this idea of business context being embedded within your chatbot LLM is really important because it might not know what you mean when you say certain things, certain terms, certain acronyms. They might be right off the top of your head because you've lived them for years. But it doesn't mean that an LLM that doesn't know your business, your infrastructure will know what those things mean. It might start to guess confidently what those things mean. Especially if you don't have great documentation, or if you have documentation in a couple different places that can be redundant or contradictory to each other. There's always a chance that something like an AI bot might miss some of that information and might give you the wrong answer. Another couple examples, in this case, survivorship bias. If we're looking at user engagement, maybe you're only, looking at a certain subset of users who stayed when you launched a feature. Maybe you are only looking at a subset of those, and maybe the AI doesn't understand that, and that's important context for you to provide to it. Um, and maybe you understood it, or maybe the product manager who gave you that request understood it, but they didn't properly convey it to you. Those are things that could maybe not be caught in the middle of an analysis. And lastly, confounding context. This is the idea that other things that could influence whatever you're looking at could impact whatever you're trying to attribute. So in marketing analytics and data, we might be trying to think about whether or not a new product change we made a big difference in user activity. But and maybe we ask an LLM that question. Maybe it knows where all of our data is, and it has all this information. We've trained it well. We asked it really good questions. But then maybe it comes back and is very confident that this product change led to this 20% increase in activity for our users. And then we share that with our leadership and everybody's excited. And then we realize, oh, wait, but there was that big marketing campaign that went out last Thursday. And that actually probably attributed to the lift. And now we can't figure out how much of it was made up from that marketing campaign or the product change we made. And there obviously are systems and technologies to help differentiate, between this sort of attribution issue. But if you're just asking a chatbot right out of the box and it doesn't know how your business is changing around you, and this information is incredibly important in context. So just a couple examples to keep in mind as you work with AI chatbots. And last but not least, this third stage is this decision packaging stage, the bottom line up front or bluff framework that I love personally. I think a lot of people are really excited about. This is that idea that you really kind of want to inverse whenever you provide conclusions. Your presentations or your reports really should start at the top with the main conclusion that you're creating. And not going into as much detail right off the bat. I've in my career experienced a lot of presentations where you get 50 slides, lots of information on what the process was, the hypotheses, why I did this. Here's a pretty graph. This is very cool. And then in the end, you eventually get to, okay, here's the decision that I'm going to make from that. This doesn't really work. Regardless of your use of AI or not, this is sort of a plug for this decision packaging framework. But it's even more important with AI because not only could you use AI to create really good bluff style documents and outputs, but also getting it thinking in that way gets AI models the right type of context on how your organization likes to function. So again, recommendation at the top, key trade-off, what you're giving up, what would change your mind, maybe just a brief set of information on that, but focus on conclusion over details, try to be as concise as possible, and really invert that explanation. And just to hit this home, hopefully a little bit more, that handoff moment is so crucial. I don't know if other folks have experienced this. You share something with someone, maybe you send a slide to someone, or you make a claim about something, based in data, hopefully. And then, a week later, you hear that it kind of trickled through the grapevine and eventually it was misinterpreted as X, Y, and Z. And you kind of have to feel like you're playing catch up to try to understand how it got there and where the, lines of information were crossed. I think a lot of us have experienced that sort of thing, and that happens. But that handoff moment is your first and key opportunity to properly translate what you are finding from whatever you're doing or whatever work you've created in the right way to the right people, so that you can trust, hopefully, with a higher level of confidence that as it trickles throughout your organization and it gets to the right people and the decision makers, that it will be consistent and you can feel confident in what's been presented. So a good translator doesn't just present, I found this, here you go, here's a chart. It's options with trade-offs, a recommendation, and the business outcome that is going to be influenced by whatever the handoff actually is. Okay, so that's a little bit about some maybe day in the life things that you can do to think about translation and maybe where some of the pitfalls are. The rest of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about how we are thinking about training and what folks out there, regardless of if you're in a managerial position or not, can do to try to build up stronger communication and translation skills within your organization. So for me, for instance, working in data analytics, throughout my career, I've interacted with a lot of folks who have gone through these data boot camps. And they're not just for data. There's a lot of kind of technology boot camps out there that kind of get you quickly up to speed. If you're new to the industry or you're coming from another industry and you want to learn the technical skills, really important over the last 15 plus years to try to learn Python, learn SQL, learn the latest tools and ML libraries and capabilities that are out there to be able to do the job that you want to do. But what's most important now in building these sorts of boot camps or training programs or educational programs is more application and communication. So teams don't really need as much anymore. Just folks, I'll make that try as clear as possible. Just folks that can code in Python. They want folks that can code in Python and understand a business problem. can frame a decision, can properly communicate with stakeholders. It's the communication built on top of the technical foundation that's important. So if you're out there and you're thinking about going to one of these boot camps, be skeptical about how much they care about the business application of what their curriculum might be, because those are the things that are going to be really important that businesses are looking for. And in my experience, the best data professionals can do both, can understand the technical nuance of what they're working on, can get their hands dirty if they need to with technical skills, but also can frame this information in the right way. Okay, so I just want to, for a second, before we talk about what your organization might look like, or how to build up to this, but like what's our gold standard? What are we trying to get to? And I thought the best way to do that would be to come up with a few things that you might notice when you see a high translation team. I've talked a lot about translation, and you're like, okay, good communicators, sure, but like, what things would be true if you had a strong team of high translators? So a few things that come to mind. One might be a little controversial, but actually might ship fewer code or fewer analysis, especially with the use of AI. The instinct is to just pump out as much information, pump out as much code as possible, because velocity and efficiency and as much data and dashboards as I can build is in the past been really important. But not only is it hard to keep up with, it's easy to get overwhelmed with a lot of information. And shipping fewer but more effective analysis and features is going to be even more important. So a high translation team will know and recognize when it makes sense to have high velocity and when it makes sense to slow down and think methodically. Additionally, less rework, right? We talked a couple examples about how you might go and work on a project and then halfway through discover that you made the wrong mistake, or you made an assumption that wasn't true, and then you've got to go back and fix something, or got to have another few conversations with stakeholders to figure out what the right direction is. But if you frame problems the right way the first time, it means less rework. If everybody on your team can explain why they do what they do, how it impacts the business, and understands that context, at least to a reasonable level, articulating that purpose, then you've got a high translation team. If you've got high stakeholder trust, you might have folks on your team that get pulled into strategy discussions. They're trusted by your stakeholders and non-technical audiences. They might not just be someone who grabs a ticket from a queue and hands it off to somebody that they don't know. They might have more of a personal connection or more opportunities to communicate with those stakeholders. And you might see that trust. That's a good sign. The focus should be balanced. Right? I think the premise of my talk is that the best individuals on your team might not be coding 100% of the time. And that's the point here, is that you might not necessarily need to be delivering technical work 100% of the time with heads down coding all the time. Again, depending on your role, because that balance between technical and communication and proper translation is well understood by your team. You understand where it makes sense to dig in and where it makes sense to pull up and communicate. You might see that from a high translation team. And last but not least, you might already be starting to think about new success metrics that help your team demonstrate the value of what it's doing. From a data perspective, for a long time, it's like I said before, it's dashboards shipped, it's tickets created, it's models deployed. It's very much this velocity driven mentality for success metrics. And while I'm not saying we need to get rid of those by any means, I'm thinking that we need to supplement those with business impact more so than we may have in the past. So measurements of decisions influenced, positive outcomes, lack of rework, really just start thinking about those new success metrics. If your team's already starting to think that way, then you probably have a high translation team. Okay, so with those things in mind, take a mental second and think about if you might have a translation gap in your organization, on your team, or yourself, looking internally. So if you ever hear the phrase, that's not what I asked for, or that's not what I intended to get, or if analysis or features get delivered but don't necessarily lead to decisions, you kind of feel like it gets thrown off the edge of a cliff and you don't really hear anything. If leadership can't articulate what your team is working on or why, if one person leaving might break the team's ability to prioritize, because then you kind of got a single point of failure as a really strong translator. And if that one person left, oh gosh, what would we do? That's a sign that you might have a translation gap. And last but not least, if the team is busy but impact is hard to measure, again, you might have a translation gap. So another way of looking at this without just checking boxes is to, be retrospective. Think back to maybe the last 5 projects you worked on. How many actually led to a documented decision? It's always important, both for your team, your leadership to understand, hey, I did this and it mattered for these reasons. Here was the decision that was made because of my analysis, or maybe the feature that I built, it led to this outcome. That stuff's really important. If you feel like you can tie those things really strongly to documented decisions or positive impacts to your organization, then you probably have a high translation team or you're a high translation individual. If you if many were requested clearly enough that the team didn't actually have to guess, maybe go through those 5 questions we talked about earlier, and you didn't have to kind of piecemeal or make some big assumptions, then you probably have a pretty good high translation organization, because then you have it from both sides. And the last thing I want to mention here before moving on is this concept that I think is pretty funny of data hubris, this idea of overconfidence in data without proper interpretation. This comes from MIT Sloan Management Review. This is the idea that, like, I'm looking at data and I feel very confident that this is true, but I don't really know that for sure, or I may not be interpreting it correctly. And so we want to prevent that as much as possible, right? The gap there isn't necessarily data quality. It could be the prettiest chart in the world, the nicest, fanciest visualization out there. But if the interpretation doesn't meet how it's being communicated to others, then there might be a sign of data hubris. So think a little bit about where your team sits. Are you on the execution heavy side where most of your time is spent building, coding, modeling, potentially with the use of AI? Or are you starting to lean translation heavy, either within the last few months because of the use of AI, or just generally that your team is just more time spent framing problems, validating output, packaging decisions, and augmenting technical work with AI and other tools to focus on where the business impact can come? So you can see, right, this trend is moving in the direction of execution heavy to translation heavy in my experience, and AI is accelerating it. But again, it doesn't mean that it's replacing the execution. It just means that it's supplementing it in an effective way. Okay, another prediction. Many teams today are spending probably half their time, if not more, doing heads down technical work and maybe a little bit of that translation business context work, thinking that through. Um, Successful teams are heading in the direction where this is not fewer people in your organization. This is fewer people spending 100% of their time just on technical execution. And what that means to any individual might be different. Some people might love that opportunity to jump in and be, presenting to stakeholders, or chatting with people about why data showed something or something, something like that. Others might not want to interact with as many people, or might not want to jump into that, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they can't be super valuable with a proper translation. Like I talked about before, AI tools require a lot of foundational context building with those semantic models and other things like that, that the more technical folks that aren't as interested in interacting with stakeholders can be heavily involved with, and can use AI to support that and support their role on technical execution. So again, I'll just say many teams today where I feel like things are shifting is more focused, maybe 75 to 80% of the time of teams focused more on translation, business context with AI augmented execution, but the same number of people on these teams, because everyone will have value in helping the business be more effective. You might be familiar with the term a unicorn. In my experience, this is somebody who can do it all, who, is strong technically and really amazing translation skills, and, they're an A+ contributor in all aspects. And, some firms are saying, I got to find the next unicorn. I want to find the next unicorn when I'm hiring. And there are people out there that are incredible at lots of things, and power to them. But we're not all like that. And so, in my opinion, these AI tools will help create the version 2 of unicorns, which I believe are data or technology professionals who can lean into translation, who might have strong or strongly building translation skills, might not necessarily have the strongest technical skills, but then with AI to help supplement that and amplify their technical execution, they themselves can also be A+ contributors to an organization. Okay, so if you're thinking about this from the hiring manager perspective, there's some things that I strongly believe you can do. And when you're writing job descriptions, you might not be lowering the bar by thinking about more soft skill and communication translation skills. I think you're just starting to measure the right thing going forward and where you're going to find the strongest people. So before, job descriptions might look like, I need 5 years of Python experience. I need strong SQL skills. I need experience with these latest and greatest tools, and I might need this certain level of education. And you'll notice this looks a lot similar to the boot camp slide that we had before, because that was the set of skills that people were learning, and those were the things that organizations were looking for. But now I'm starting to see industries move more towards the after, this set of things on the right, the ability to translate ambiguous business problems into analytical questions, experience translating findings into stakeholder-ready recommendations. Most importantly, strong foundational technical foundation in things like Python or SQL, augmented by AI tools, but maybe phrasing along the lines of domain expertise valued equally to tool proficiency. So if you see language like this on job descriptions, then you can know that this organization is already starting to think about how data professionals or technology professionals can lean more into this translation skill, and that might be what they're looking for. If you're a hiring manager out there, I strongly recommend trying to lean into some of this wording because I think you're going to find not only people who are excited to utilize AI, but they're excited to use it in a way that can benefit your team, benefit your business. And then in terms of interviewing, a couple suggestions. You might already be thinking about these sorts of things when you're interviewing folks. You might get responses where folks jump straight into methodology or they use jargon. They don't really have the context of why they're using that jargon. They can't articulate why the work mattered that they did, maybe the outcomes, who cared, who they interacted with. And they might just focus on like the latest really cool model or technique. Um, in my opinion, stronger responses are those where people ask clarifying questions first, they frame the business impact, they explain trade-offs in plain language, and they might be able to recommend a clear path forward. Of course, all embedded within this is the right technical skills, but on top of that, if you can create a really strong, exciting narrative and you can explain why you did what you did, the tools you used, and the outcome and impact you had, that's going to make a big difference. For the longest time, throughout my career, people always advocate for, on the resume, have a section that shows metrics. Okay, I did this and it led to this outcome. This is just an extension of that, and it's particularly heightened in this world of AI. Okay, a couple things outside of hiring that I recommend folks think about when you're trying to build the muscle of good translation on your team. If you're in a team where multiple people are working on the same types of projects, then these are things that I would recommend for you. The first is more stakeholder exposure. Again, caveating that some folks might be more excited about this than others, but where it makes sense, pairing junior folks or folks working on translation skills with a stakeholder once a week or letting them shadow in meetings where you're going to get some of this, face-to-face time just to learn and absorb that sort of thinking and language makes a big difference in my experience. The draft first rule I'm a big fan of, which is this idea of like, challenge the person who's working on translation skills to draft the problem statement. Maybe ask them, hey, here's a project. Going back to those 5 questions in stage one of the problem statement, who cares, why, what's the timeline, what's the impact? Basically, ask them those types of questions and see if they can give you answers that you agree with. And if not, have them pair up with a senior person or a strong translation translator from your team, and they can help build that skill up by doing over time. That ties to the next point, collaborative review. If your team is one that gets together a lot, brainstorms, collaborates, reviews questions and problems together, I think this is an incredible way to help those that might not have the best translation skills who are excited to learn more of those skills. It's a great way to get them up to speed and leaning on the mentorship of the strong translators and communicators in your team. And of course, iterative practice. Translation is not something that is built in a day. It's something that's built over time, learning from others, learning what works, and leaning on the mentors around us. Okay, and then measuring it, you might be asking like, okay, a good communication skills, like how does this matter? How do I, what's the benchmark? What's the metric? How do I help convince, my stakeholders or leaders that this is something worth spending time on? And a few things that come to mind. We've kind of talked about some of these already, but if you can measure decision rate, as you're building projects, or you're coming together as organizations and making decisions, what percentage of the completed work led to a documented decision, especially one with a positive outcome? If you feel like a lot of things are fizzling out or organization can't really figure out the direction to go, then there's probably a translation problem, and tracking that over time can tell you if you're heading in the right direction. Secondly, stakeholder satisfaction. For a lot of us, the world of in being in data, you are supporting a business unit or business partners, and being able to say with confidence that you answered the question that they had, and having them provide that feedback to you, either qualitatively or potentially quantitatively as well, if you're collecting data on that over time, that can be hugely impactful to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. We talked about this before, but rework rate I think is incredibly important. Hopefully important to those on the call as well, because you don't want to redo something that you've already done. It's frustrating for everybody. So how often does the team need to redo work because the question was wrong? A lot of tools, Jira and other things out there can capture things like estimated story points, or, metrics on how long you think something's going to take. And then you can kind of do that comparison after the fact. Did you have to adjust the story point estimate if your organization does that? Did you have to go back and create another ticket? Did you have to totally change the success criteria? Did the project take weeks longer than you expected? You can capture those things hopefully along the way, and you can be retrospective about them and why that happened. And last but not least, time to decision. Fast decision doesn't always mean a good decision, but at least generally, it'll give you a sense of when you received a question or a problem, how long it took to provide an answer to the person that you were looking for. If you're tracking that over time, then it can give you an idea of how good this translation capability is. And more importantly, with the use of AI tools to help speed up this sort of time to answer, it can help you understand whether or not these tools are being used effectively, because somebody might just be going back and forth with an AI tool all day to get the right answer that they agree with, when they probably could have maybe just come up with the answer themselves in a shorter amount of time. To properly use these AI tools, if you can build out that business context, the semantic layers and things we talked about before briefly, you can speed up this time to decision. Okay. And just the last thing I want to use this opportunity to mention is lots of organizations, the world loves the phrase data driven. I think it's a good term, but I think it's starting to become a little outdated in the sense that it kind of implies data is driving the decision, or data is making the decision. And I think it's important to think more from a data informed standpoint. It's a subtle difference, but I think being a data informed organization or a team implies that you are taking in all of the information, the data around you, the experience and intuition of your team, the domain knowledge you might have built out within your organization or your own brain. And all of that coming together makes a big difference in the outcomes, in my experience. So again, one last plug to say that we should get rid of data hubris, not having overconfidence in data without any good interpretation. This is a clear failure. Data-driven is probably fine, but really what we want to be striving for is being data-informed. Okay. Thank you for taking the time today. Just a few takeaways as I wrap up. Again, the bottleneck, in my experience, is not execution anymore. AI is making this undeniable. AI is allowing teams to be faster than they ever were before, to build out more capability and features than they ever were before. But the bottleneck is properly translating to AI to make sure you get the right answer, translating the answer from AI to the right audiences in the right way. All of these things are really important. Prompting AI well, again, is just like directing a data team or interacting with your stakeholders, delegating, managing. Those same skills are now visible And the feedback loop to get information on how you're doing with that skill is real time. In the past, you might have had to, delegate out to a team. You'd give them a few days to do some work. They'd come back. You'd realize, I probably asked that wrong or gave them some wrong direction. Now with AI, you can kind of learn in real time if you're asking the right question or if you're asking it in a way that it can get confused. So we're all kind of learning in this ability to use these AI tools, how good of communicators and question askers are we? So these skills are incredibly important, really, in all aspects of what you do. Remember the three stages: framing the problem, judging the quality, packaging the decision. And please actively try to build out this translation capacity within your teams. Diagnose your gap, hire for it, create rituals, try to think about it day to day, talk about it as a team. And if you can, measure it so you know you're heading in the right direction. And lastly, your value as a data professional or a technology professional, a big part of it is in the business impact of the work that you do. So be sure to invest in the skills that drive it. So I'll just end by saying execution gets cheaper every day. AI is incredible in lots of ways, but translation only gets more valuable. So try to find your translators on your team, develop them, promote them. They are your multiplier. Thank you very much. And now I will take some Q&A.
Yeah, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and Steve will be monitoring the chat, make sure that we get to them. But while we're waiting for people to put some in, so Zach, one of the things you talked about was prompting well. I mean, how are you ensuring that the data that you're getting back from the LLMs is accurate? Because I mean, so many times I can just change the prompt a little bit, and you said this in your last presentation, and it really affects, the information that you're getting back. So shouldn't there be a step to kind of validate and verify what you're getting from that LLM?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. I think trust but verify is incredibly important. I think you probably can't know with certainty all the time that what you're getting out is going to be perfect. So I think the motivation is to head in the right direction by building out some of these, context capabilities, verifying over time, starting to build trust with these AI tools. Um, but again, it doesn't mean blindly just accepting everything it says. I feel like it kind of goes in phases. Right off the bat, my experience, my teams, you want to be very skeptical and you want to say, okay, let me verify every join on every table and make sure every acronym it uses is right. And then slowly over time, you might start to build some trust. You want to make sure that trust is reasonable and verifiable. But at the end of the day, if you spend more time verifying an AI output than you would have spent, creating the outcome yourself, then you definitely didn't, use the tool effectively. So, building out some of those semantic views models, there's a lot of good techniques that are being talked about out there. That in conjunction with trust and verify at the beginning as you start to use these tools can help you understand where they might break down in your team, in your organization, and where you can trust them more.
Okay, one more question, because I know there are questions in the chat, but you've worked in such a variety of organizations. What are some big differences that you see for the data translator role using AI in like a small startup versus like a big Fortune 500 company?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, it's kind of in parallel to the role of being in technology at those types of organizations in general. If you're at a startup, you're probably wearing more hats than you might at a big company. And so, the experience and expectation of somebody using AI, who's in a technology role might be that you are going kind of end to end. You're answering business questions, you're proposing those questions. You might be, doing a lot of the pieces instead of, maybe a more narrow but uh, focused scope on whatever part, whatever role you have within a larger organization.
Mhm.
And so, this presentation is all to say that like it's not like scope of a role in a large organization is growing. It's just that it makes those, those handoffs easier and being able to communicate effectively between different roles in your organization are going to make a big difference.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Steve, do you want to read some of the questions that are in the chat?
Well, one question that was asked was So one thing you were talking about was documenting decisions, and one question was, what does documenting or a documented decision look like? How does a project team or its sponsor know if it was the correct decision? Does that happen during the project or only after delivery, in production or something like that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's probably not one size fits all. It probably depends very heavily on your organization, how you function, how you communicate. But I will say I think it happens both during and definitely after. I think probably it mostly happens after, where you can kind of pull up for a second and think about how things went and did you get the right outcome. And it could be as simple as a week or two after whatever handoff happened, going back to the stakeholder and saying, hey, remember how we worked on this? Just want to check in with you. Did you get what you were looking for? Just want to make sure, we're trying to keep track of this. We're trying to make sure we're doing the right thing. Any feedback you can provide, and even some anecdotal stuff like that can be really useful in making sure you're delivering effectively.
All right. And then there was another question. The observation that prompts in natural language seem like the least precise way to interact with an LLM. And so the question is, are there common document structures that people use for this? To this person, it looks like an ideal place for a domain-specific language.
Mm,
Yeah, very interesting question.
that is a good question.
Yes. So in my experience, there are more effective ways to interact and provide context to these LLMs. I think um, being incredibly verbose can actually hurt you more so than you might expect. And so the right structure in terms of like language structure is generally pretty like quick and concise information. In my experience, the structure is not necessarily providing paragraphs and paragraphs of business context or details, but more pointers to other documentation that exists within your organization. Again, assuming you trust that documentation, hopefully, like if you have some trusted information, it's more about pointing to the LLM and saying, hey, when you get this type of question, this is what, some of the documentation you want to utilize. In my experience, that works really well. I know Claude, for instance, heavily uses Markdown files and YAML files that can be structured in a way that can kind of be human readable, but also structured in a way that's efficient for these AI tools. So those are a couple maybe more technical specific answers, but yeah, hopefully that helps. It's a really good question.
Mm,
All right. And there was one more question in chat from Tom Gilmore. I'm not sure if you want to unmute and just ask your question. I'll just go ahead and read it.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yep. Go
Yes.
Can
ahead.
you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, just could you discuss why an organization would not press forward immediately with their own cascade hybrid SLM, LLM RAG specified to their own needs and discuss the security risks, especially of your government going to any country agnostic forum directly and discuss the agglomeration of information from different sources that can cause the up classification of information.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, great question, Tom. I don't think I can speak to all of the aspects and nuances to your question, but I definitely, can think more about that. Just to hit on your first point, why some organizations might not lean into, RAG modeling or utilizing AI trained for their purposes. Um, if I'm understanding your question correctly there, I think it's very often a huge cost to think about incorporating, your own AI tools. Sometimes it's experience or expertise within the organization. Sometimes utilizing things that are off the shelf can lead to more effective, 80% solution outcomes faster.